In 1066, William the Conqueror and his fleet set off from here on the coast of Normandy. It was a remarkably well-timed trip that way, across the English Channel. The riches of England lay just over the horizon, and it was a land that would turn this Norman duke into a king. English history was about to change forever. The Normans were coming, and nothing would be the same again. But who were William and his band of rugged warriors? Who were the Normans, and what made them so good at conquering? How did heathen Viking raiders, Northmen, turn into Christian Norman rulers and adventurers, spreading across the globe? Soon, there was not a part of medieval Europe or even the Middle East that didn't feel the impact of their presence. In this series, I'm exploring how these Northmen made roots in Normandy and established a new type of society, and following the roots of conquest to find out what made the Normans uniquely successful 1,000 years ago. We are here in Normandy to meet these all-conquering men and women of the North. This part of northern France has always been a prosperous area. The Romans and later Germanic tribes were attracted by these riches. From the 5th century, this area then fell under Frankish control, culminating with the great European empire created by Charlemagne. Look at this absolutely luscious Norman countryside. It's incredibly fertile, and it's not just a great place for crops, but it also grows the most important crop in the Middle Ages, sheep, who are covered in wool. In a world before indoor heating, sheep and their wool mean riches, and it keeps people warm. So not only is this a wonderful place for agriculture more generally, it's a great place to be a shepherd. This means wealth and power. The Merovingian dynasty, which controlled the Frankish kingdom for centuries, took a shine to this fertile and connected area and its abundant resources. They called it Neustria, and established royal residences and monasteries across the land, including one of the most famous of them all. The medieval pilgrims struggling their way across these windy tide flats were on their way to what they called St. Michael in Peril of the Sea. But today we know it better as the magnificent monastery of Mont Saint-Michel. The Abbey of Saint-Michel, holding relics of the Archangel St. Michael, was established just off the Frankish coast in the 8th century. It soon flourished as a place of prayer and pilgrimage. But this area had a problem. The same things that meant it was able to support religious life, well-connectedness, and wealth, meant it was also susceptible to attacks from the sea. Sea-borne raiders from across northern Europe had plundered the region since Roman times. But in the late 8th century, it was about to get a whole lot worse. Now there was a new threat from Scandinavia, the people we call the Vikings. Through the 8th century, they increasingly came into contact with northern European kingdoms, trading and raiding. With their formidable longboats and surprise attacks by sea and river, the Vikings sailed far and wide in search of wealth and power. But the place where the Viking story had some of its most dramatic beginnings was northern France. The rich land, cities, and great rivers were a magnet for the Vikings. So we are here in Rouen on the banks of the Seine. And from 790 onwards, this was essentially a highway for Vikings. Now, before this, the Vikings had already been raiding up and down the coast of the North Sea. But by 790, they set their sights on the Seine because this is an incredibly fertile and wealthy part of the world. So from 790, the locals essentially have to put up with summer being the Viking season. And yes, you've got a great farm, but at any moment, a band of warriors might come burn it down and enslave you. It's testament to the fact that this is an incredibly rich place to live, and it's worth putting up with this kind of terror. From 841, the Viking raids intensified in Normandy. The town of Rouen was plundered and burned. The Vikings encroached further and further down the Seine, and in 845 they reached Paris. At the siege, Ragnar Lodbrok, the Viking hero, led the Northmen to plunder and occupy the city, withdrawing only after the Frankish king Charles the Bald paid a ransom, the first Danegeld tribute collected from the Franks. By the mid-9th century, Viking incursions are just a facet of life in the lower Seine Valley. If you live here, you know that in the summer they're going to come. But by 851, something changes. Instead of returning to Scandinavia in the winter, the Vikings decide they're going to overwinter here. Suddenly, Vikings aren't something that you put up with in the summer. They're here to stay. And it didn't help that the Franks were at war with themselves. Charles the Bald took the reins in the westernmost Frankish kingdom, but had to fight his own aristocrats as well as the Vikings. Northern France was there for the taking.
So this is an absolute delight. It's a replica Frankish village from around the time the Northmen would have been showing up here, about the end of the 8th century. Of course, if Vikings showed up to pillage here, I think they'd be a little bit disappointed. The church that they would want to steal from is still under construction. But still, this is an excellent opportunity to see what things would have been like at that time, and I have got all dressed up for the occasion.
To really understand the remarkable success of the Vikings, we've got to examine their most precious weapon, the Viking longboat.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
That is just incredible.
Yeah, we are really proud of this one.
I can imagine.
We really like to row with it.
I'm meeting with Mehdi Safer, whose team at Park Ornevik constructed a longboat using the tools available to the Vikings.
So I think it's fair to say that the Viking longboat is really the most impressive piece of tech about these people. So how do you make an incredible ship like this?
First of all, I think the boat should be made with the keel, which is like a spine for the boat. After that, we will start to make stems. All the strength of those boats, it's what we call clinker built. It means that the first planks will be set on the keel and overlap each planks, which allow us to have a strength boat, and then it will be also very light. So it's the best way to make a Viking ship. After this, we also have a mast, which allow the Vikings to also make sail, which allows them to go very far, like America, or even further on the east until the Volga River.
So how difficult is it to make something like this? Could any Viking do it, or is this a very special skill?
No, it's very special skill. First of all, they will use oak trunks to make almost all parts of the hull. They will take the trunk and then they will just cleave the wood in some pieces, almost until 16 pieces. And from this, they will start to work only with very basic tools such as axes or broad axes. So everything will be handmade. So look at this plank here. And as you see, I could basically hold it with 2 of my fingers.
Wow.
So those planks were very, very light. But also, if you can take apart, you will see how flexible it is. Wow. That allows the boat to go along the waves.
Thank you. Oh, that's so cool. Sorry, I'm just freaking out.
Welcome on Longvin, then.
You have no idea how much this means to me. This is an absolute dream come true.
Yeah, that's incredible to have such a boat.
I can't help noticing how small it is. You wouldn't have that many men in it necessarily, right?
In this one, we can go up to 12 or 15 men. But we had evidence of boats going up to 30, 35 meters long. And on these ones, you can go up to 70 men. And I think you wouldn't want 70 Vikings coming to your church.
How do we take, the different pieces of tech we've seen over there, flexible planks? What are the advantages?
First of all, the flexibility allows you to go through the waves, going along it, because it will be flexible. And the other thing, it's light. So when you come to a beach, you can drag it on the beach, or if you want to escape from Franks, you can just grab it and change river. It is a shallow hull boat. So Vikings will go where you don't expect them. These boats, it's really what gives the advantages to those Vikings.
I did the thing I always hate, and I immediately jumped to talking about the Vikings as just raiders and pillagers, but they're also so much more than that, right?
Much more than that. First of all, what we have here is what we call langskip. So these ones will be mostly for war or pillaging. But there are other types of boats. They had trade ships. After all, Vikings, before being pillagers, they are traders. So they are famous for fur trade, amber trade, ivory from the walrus trade, slave trades too. So sometimes they would maybe not even take these boats, but change boats along the way.
So it's almost like you do it as a relay. Stop, change boat again.
Exactly. So they went also to Baghdad. So they were traders and they would go everywhere.
So I guess what we can say about Vikings is just like the planks that make their boats. They are really flexible people.
Yes, exactly.
The Vikings' maritime superiority gave them the unique advantage of surprise. But the Northmen who came here were also masters at flexibility, at being able to take on characteristics of the culture they found. Moving on from the Frankish village, I'm exploring Park Ornevik's Viking village to see how local culture developed.
So you've got a whole Viking village here. Are all of these buildings based on archaeological finds from Normandy?
Not really. For example, this one is based on Swedish archaeological finds. In Normandy, we have almost no finds from our Vikings. Why? Well, because mostly they integrated well, they intermarry, they will adopt the local culture. As well, the Frankish culture would be like a soft power back then. It was the old empire of Charlemagne, so when they came here, they stopped to talk Norse. They started to learn the language, the culture.
So I suppose that the Frankish life is so good and the Vikings are so flexible, you're just going to have them integrate rather than try to impose a specific culture, yeah?
Yes, that's exactly what happened here.
As the Vikings encroached further into Neustria and began to overwinter here, monastic communities were increasingly terrorized. In 847 AD, they pillaged the original abbey at Mont Saint-Michel. Then, they turned their attention inland to the great religious houses along the Seine Valley, places like the great monastery at Fontenelle.
There was a reason that the Vikings were attracted to attacking monasteries specifically, and that's because they held incredible wealth. They also knew that the monks had taken vows of nonviolence, so if they were attacked, there was nothing that they could do. Further, because Vikings were pagan, they didn't really care about offending the Christian god by attacking his houses and stealing all his wealth. It was a recipe for disaster.
The monks of Fontenelle have left a remarkable record of the events in the 850s. No monastery was safe from the Viking attacks.
They laid waste all the monasteries and other places along the banks of the Seine, or else took large payments and left them thoroughly terrified.
Viking forces active in the region repeatedly passed within striking distance of Fontenelle on their way up and down the river. The monastic community here at Fontenelle would bear the brunt of several of these Viking attacks.
The first occurred in 851 in October, when the Vikings sacked it, stealing all of the treasure and terrorizing the monks. Not content, 89 days later, they returned. Finding that the monks were still gone, having taken all of the treasure they could carry as well as all of their relics, they were enraged. They burnt the monastery to the ground. This was so devastating that the community wouldn't be able to return until the 10th century.
The monks record their sense of terror as the Vikings destroyed their sacred home, even taking the holy relics of their patron saint.
Out of fear, and due to the oppression of these execrable heathens, the sacred bones and blessed ashes of the honorable confessor of Christ, Wandriel, having been disinterred from their tombs, were carried away from the monastery of Fontenelle.
Fontenelle is one of our best sources for information about what living with Viking raids was like. The annals of Fontenelle record in minute detail actual Viking incursions, which is a pretty big deal. Is the source biased? Well, yes, because it's written by the monks. But you'd be pretty biased if someone was coming and burning your house down too.
Viking attacks had created a huge crisis for Carolingian rulers. They justified their rule as representatives of God's authority on earth. So, a bunch of pagan warriors attacking their lands and harassing the clergy threw their authority into doubt. Weakened with internal divisions and with no permanent army, the Franks were forced to find a way to manage the unrelenting incursions of the Vikings. One remarkable Viking leader seized on this fragility. It led to an absolutely extraordinary event, right here in Rouen.
In 912, Rouen Cathedral was host to an incredible scene. Rollo, the local Viking leader, was baptized as a Christian. But it wasn't just Rollo. Hundreds of Viking retainers, his entire family, were all baptized at the same time.
Imagine the medieval cathedral full of Franks and Vikings mixing together. Pagan warriors queuing up to be baptized and taken into the Christian fold.
And this is a powerful symbol. It means that they mean to stay and integrate with the local area. They're not going to be fighting with the local French people anymore. As a part of this, Rollo also took a new name. He became Robert. He was named after his godfather, Robert II, who was the Marquis of Neustria. And again, this underscores the fact that they mean to be something entirely new. They're not just a bunch of Norse Vikings anymore. These are local people with a local religion, local names, and possibly new local customs.
Rollo, in taking on the name Robert and embracing the Christian church, became the first leader of Normandy. But how did this Viking leader and his band of marauding warriors get to this remarkable scene in Rouen Cathedral? He was already well known in the city, and not in a good way. Rollo's story began 36 years earlier when, as a pagan Viking, he besieged and took Rouen from the Franks.
Rollo is arguably one of the most important Normans to ever live, but paradoxically, we don't actually know that much about him until he comes here to Normandy. In the 11th century, people are saying that he was a Danish nobleman whose brother had got in trouble with the king and who fled here. A century later, people are saying that he was actually Norwegian and was a dignified nobleman who came here to conquer what he could. By the 13th century, the Icelandic saga of Snorri Sturluson says that he was Hrolf the Walker, a man so large that he couldn't ride a horse. Now, these are all light on actual facts, but what it shows us is that Rollo was an important enough person in the Middle Ages that if they didn't have facts, they were willing to make them up. This myth-making is as important to medieval people as any dates or names are to us.
Rollo's real-world adventures here began with violence. He took on the local ruler and besieged Rouen, virtually flattening it in the process. Hungry for more, Rollo took part in the siege of Paris in 885, and then captured Bayeux. Rollo was skilled with the usual Viking tools of violence and chaos, but he also cultivated the local nobility, and even married Papa, the daughter of a French noble. Her exact parentage is uncertain, and may have been invented to legitimize their son, William Longsword. Her rather sweet statue, made much later, still stands in Bayeux. Whatever Papa's real origins, by marrying her, Rollo was entering a powerful network of kinship. This would be the blueprint of Norman power. Conquest through terror and force, but then settlement, intermarriage, and adaptation to local society. Rollo continued to attack further and further down the Seine. He laid siege to Chartres in April 911. Eventually, after months of intense pressure on the city, the king, Charles the Simple, decided to counterattack and sent a coalition relief army to assist the besieged people of Chartres. The king's forces succeeded, and Rollo retreated back to Rouen. Rollo may have lost, but this was a major turning point in his fortunes. It showed that he was firmly entrenched in the heart of the kingdom, and Charles was tired of fighting. Compromise was necessary. Lengthy negotiations between Rollo and King Charles culminated with the famous Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte.
The treaty gave the Normans much more stability, but it also meant that they were now technically vassals of the French king. And that meant that they had to do homage. As a part of this, it meant that they were supposed to get on their knees and kiss the French king's feet. Legend has it that Rollo refused to do this, and instead sent one of his own vassals to do it in his stead. A second and more dramatic version of the story insists that Rollo pretended he was going to kneel down and instead toppled the king over backwards off of his chair. Now, these are legends, and there's probably no truth to them, but they exist because they tell us that the Normans were still incredibly proud. Yes, they were vassals of the French king, but they saw themselves as something entirely different, a sort of people that were too powerful to do homage.
Rollo had realized that the route to power called for diplomacy, including taking the king's daughter Gisela's hand in marriage. Rollo's second marriage was Christian, setting Gisela apart from his first wife Papa, whose marriage had more Danico status, a Scandinavian custom which allowed for more than one wife. In the tiny village of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, Rollo swore loyalty to the king, agreed to protect him from other Viking raiders, and promised to convert to Christianity. In return, the king offered Rollo all the land between the river Epte and the sea. The province of Normandy was born. Rollo's baptism in 912 AD was a key step on his integration into the Frankish world. And there's written evidence from just a few years later that backs this up. I'm meeting historian Pierre Baudouin.
So what's very interesting about this is that ordinarily with Viking settlements, I expect less written documentation and more archaeological evidence, but you actually have some written evidence to show us, don't you?
Yes, there is a diploma that is a royal acta of Charles the Simple with the first document who mentions Rollo and his companions. And the documents are they written in 918. So it's the first written evidence of Rollo. And so what it said, that the Abbey of La Croix-Saint-Lefroy is given to the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, but this abbey had been given to the Norman of the Seine, that is Rollo, and his companions for the protection of the kingdom, pro tutela regni.
So that's amazing because it shows us that already at this point in time, Rollo is integrated to the point that the king understands him as a protector.
Rollo, the former pagan Northman, but now newly baptized, was now trusted by the king in Paris to protect great Christian sites, the Viking was fast becoming a Norman. Rollo's mass baptism marked the beginning of a complex process of Christianization for the Vikings in Normandy. To understand more about the importance of Christianity to the first leaders, I'm meeting Professor Leonie Hicks.
So I think arguably one of the most important moments in the history of the Normans is this conversion of Rollo to Christianity. But how much can we know about this really? Is this something that is entirely pragmatic and political, or is this something that is genuinely spiritual?
The short answer is we can't be certain that it's something that he's doing out of faith. So one of the ways in which Vikings, Northmen, whatever we want to call them, are made acceptable is to suggest, well, we will, yes, give you some land, but we want something in return, which is for you to convert. So that's, if you like, the diplomatic, political aspect of conversion. But what we do know is that after Rollo was baptised, following the Treaty of St. Clair-Sept, he did make donations to the major Norman abbeys. And we also have indications that towards the end of his life, or during his life, he ransomed captives who were Christians. Rather, one of the chroniclers says, I don't know, Shaban says, before he would have beheaded them.
Okay.
But now he ransomed them or set them free because that was the right thing to do. But what we can say is that certainly the dukes, or the counts of Rouen, as we should call him in this early stage, did take on the board that being a Christian was something you should at least seen to be, and seen to be doing the right things. And I think we need to think of this as a process. So he might be, well, I think this is a good idea, so yes, I'll be baptised, and then gradually faith deepens. So it's very much process. So the longer these people spend around churchmen and hearing sermons and so on, that the faith sort of deepens. We can never get in anybody's heads as historians. We do have a slightly different take on it. So Archbishop Guy of Rouen, Guy writes to the Archbishop of Reims and said, I've got a problem. I've got these Northmen that are settled in the Seine Valley. This is in the first decade or so of the 10th century. They've converted. They're sort of lapsing a bit, and they're going back to some of their pagan ways. They don't really know what to do. The Pope gets involved, and the advice is be patient. So very much following the model that St. Augustine adopted when he came at the late 6th century to England. Be patient, teach them, persevere. You know, they might be genuine in some respects. These are long-seated traditions that they're not ready to give up yet. So we get these tantalising glimpses of the process that Rollo and his descendants must have gone through to actually come to some sort of faith that was perceived as genuine by contemporaries.
Well, I think that one thing is clear here is that as much as this might be a pragmatic decision on Rollo's part to convert, it's also really pragmatic on the part of the church as well.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The problem is what to do with these quite violent people who have been raiding up and down the river. They've got as far as Paris and Chartres. You need to come to some arrangement with them to stop the violence. And so, yes, it is pragmatic on both sides. By becoming Christian, the Normans then become less alien, less other. They become more like the Franks, and they can then start to work within that political and diplomatic sphere that the Franks are used to. It's an accepted way of bringing people into the fold, of coming to a modus vivendi with other groups of people and actually getting along.
As a band of Viking pirates became a new and settled political force, this also meant embracing a new religion. And the Normans did this as they did with everything, fiercely. If they were going to be Christians, they were going to be the biggest and best Christians you'd ever seen. And that meant doing things like expanding things here at Mont Saint-Michel. There had been churches here since the Merovingian period, but the Normans established a new monastery where there would be monks who could pray for their souls as they engaged in warfare. But how was there even a church here for the Normans to expand on in the first place? After all, the Vikings had been raiding up and down the coastline here for centuries. Well, locals attributed the protection to the intercession of Saint Michael the Archangel, who this church is named after. Saint Michael was the leader of God's army. He was responsible for defeating Satan in the war between the angels and the rebel demons. This fierce and warlike approach to Christianity would have really appealed to the Normans, who saw themselves not just as Christians, but defenders of Christianity against the Norse pagan Vikings.
Rollo was revered for turning the Viking Northmen into Norman Christians. When he died, he was buried in Rouen Cathedral, the site of the pivotal baptism which cemented the place of the duchy in the Christian European world. A later version of his tomb is still here.
This is Rollo's tomb. He was buried here in Rouen Cathedral, the same place that he was baptized, which is a really explicit statement about his connection to the place and his conversion to Christianity. But we don't actually know when Rollo died. We know he was certainly dead by 933. This is just kind of a guess based on when he drops out of records. However, by this point, he'd already passed on power to his son, William Longsword. And William integrated really well into the line of succession. His mother was a local. He was born a Christian, so he had nothing to prove. And things passed on really smoothly. And that's really testament to what Rollo was able to achieve. His son was accepted as a ruler, and it's because he'd created something very new, a Norman dynasty.
Rollo's son, William Longsword, seems to have been a sincere Christian, and he was the first duke to take interest in the restoration of the monasteries. He expanded his border westward, and was able to give the canons of Mont Saint-Michel several estates in Auvergne. The monasteries were a kind of insurance policy, religious castles where the monks engaged in endless spiritual warfare against Satan on their behalf.
This is the oldest extant part of Mont Saint-Michel. Built in the early 10th century, and it's a wonderful example of what we call Romanesque architecture, where you get these gorgeous rounded arches. And it's a very French form of architecture, and there's no surprises there. When the Normans became local, they wanted everyone to understand that they knew what a church looked like. They were building Frankish churches because they were a new type of Frankish person. And not only did they build churches, they built the best and most beautiful versions of them. They weren't just some Vikings fresh off the boat from Norway. They knew what it meant to be a Frank.
William Longsword continued and completed the expansion of Normandy westwards, receiving Continent and Avranches from the king. Scandinavian through his father and Frankish through his mother, William had been brought up a Christian. He should have been accepted by both communities. But not everyone was happy with the growth of Norman power and lands. On the 17th of December, 942, William was assassinated by the men of Arnulf, the Count of Flanders. Marriage alliances could work in the Normans' favor, but they could also create perilous difficulties.
On the one hand, you can convert and you become in the same religious, cultural, political milieu as the people that you're living among. But if you start marrying them, you form very strong political alliances. You've got friends on your borders that you can call on. There's that expectation then that you're not going to be fighting with, say, the Duke of Aquitaine or the Duke of Brittany. William Longsword marries Leada of Vermandois. The problem comes, Arnulf Flanders is actually excluded. He sees himself as excluded from this series of marriage alliances. So instead of having a nice ally on the northeastern borders of Normandy, you end up with somebody who is outside this sort of charm circle of all the marriages that William's making. And Arnulf possibly feels left out of these connections and sees other nobles profiting in alliance with the Normans, and so this might be one of the reasons, as well as the expansionist nature of the Normans, that leads to William's murder.
And that seems to be why William Longsword met a violent end, at the behest of a jealous rival for power in northern France.
By 942, William is succeeded by his son, Richard I. But that's not really an obvious point of succession because Richard wasn't a legitimate son. He's born in a really Viking way. His mother is not actually the queen, it's a Breton concubine named Sprata. So we know that there are still kind of Viking concubines kicking about the court. But he's not Viking enough that he speaks Norse, so his father sends him away to Besson, which is near Bayeux, in order to learn Norse, make sure he understands where his roots are. Another Viking thing about Richard is that he allows a slave market to operate here in Rouen, which it continues to do up until about the year 1000. That's super odd for a Christianized people because the church is really big on saying that Christians can't enslave other Christians. However, Richard is like, well, Vikings are bringing in enslaved people from Ireland and England. It's not my fault. And he wants to make sure that he's still connected with his Viking roots. He doesn't want to make the other Norse people angry. This is a real tension that really embodies what it means to be Norman.
Despite difficult beginnings, Richard would rule Normandy for more than 50 years. He relied on the church for support and restored more church land, and established his second son, Robert II, as the Archbishop of Rouen. Peace and security again reigned in Normandy. By the time of Richard's death, aged 64 in 996, he had become known as Richard the Fearless. There was an idea of Normanness that hadn't existed before. Within 2 generations, Normandy was a consolidated duchy with a heritage and a dynastic family, not Viking nor French, but something new entirely.
Richard I is succeeded by his son, Richard II. And really, Richard II's rule is completely defined by order and stability. He's the person who makes the borders of Normandy what they still are today. And as a part of this, he makes shrewd political moves like marrying his sister off to the King of England. He also commissions Dudo of Saint-Quentin to write the family history, which is how we know about all of his ancestors, basically from Rollo up to him. All of these are calculated moves, and they show that the Normans are not a family of chaos and anarchy. They are one of stability and order.
The initial task of the first 4 leaders had been to expand, define, and protect Normandy's borders, which in the beginning were constantly under threat. In doing so, they created and strengthened a durable duchy. Richard II understood the importance of myth-making and cultural heritage. Like his predecessors, he was creating a dynasty through strategic marriages. But the Norman approach to marriage was much more complex than it may seem from the records.
So what we find is that often the dukes are marrying Frankish women because that's politically expedient, but they also have what some historians call concubines, or we might call mistresses or partners, but very actually quite deep long-term relationships with women of Danish or Norman Danish ancestry. For example, Gunnar would be a very good case here. So Gunnar married Richard I, and in the 12th century, Robert of Torigny, updating the Gesta Normanorum Ducum, tells us about this cloak marriage, whereby Richard and Gunnar marry each other, and the children are surrounded with a cloak. The parents and the children are surrounded with a cloak to make them legitimate. But what is very interesting is the way that Dudo, our main source for early Normandy, what he does is to show us that the children that are succeeding are all from these partnerships rather than the marriages with Frankish women. That we don't have children from these Frankish marriages recorded at all. So either they didn't have any children, or they died, or Dudo just didn't write about them. But the people inheriting and the ducal line are coming from the partnerships, the concubines, the mistresses, the partners, whatever we want to call them, which is very interesting in terms of perhaps how the Normans are perceiving themselves. So on one level, yes, we're Frankish or we're like the Franks, but actually we have our own identity too.
Gunnar was a remarkable Norman woman. She was mistress, then wife to Richard I, and functioned as regent of Normandy during the absence of her spouse.
We also have a very actually vitriolic, nasty poem about an Irish poet, Murray, by Warner of Rouen. But at the end of that, we have, as Murray tries to find his wife who's been sold into slavery and his daughter, he appears before Gunnar at court. And we see here an image of a powerful woman who has the ability to manumit slaves and to exercise some kind of power and influence and authority on her own behalf. She's incredibly long-lived, so she was a figure of great continuity, of great wisdom. We see her witnessing charters, so she's a very, very important lady.
The Northmen had realized that to make wealth and power permanent, they had to learn to run a state. Their new neighbors showed them how. They mastered French social structures, administration, and legal systems with their customary ferocious energy and ambition. And they began to speak Latin and French, mainly because they needed to play Western European religion and politics. They established castles as bases for control. This is mighty Falaise in central Normandy, where I'm meeting historian Matthias Dillies.
Oh, wow. What an incredible view. Well, here we are on the stunning walls of Falaise Castle, and can you tell me when this incredible building was founded?
Well, the whole castle was actually founded in around 960 by Normandy's third Duke, Richard the Fearless. And we have here in Falaise one of the first stone castles of Normandy.
That's a really strong kind of statement about what he means to do in his ambitions for a dynasty, because it's one thing to be a conqueror and come in and burn things down and completely antagonize the church. It's another to situate yourself as a part of the local landscape.
That's why they were so smart, because they understood very quickly that if they had just remained this colonizing force in Normandy and crushing the local population, they wouldn't get anywhere. So they have the church on their side, and they try to have the local population on their side. And so if you build a castle, that means you offer protection to the local population. And so this definitely will make you very popular.
And in that way, a castle like this is more than just a strategic position, but it's symbolic, yes?
Yeah, that's right. You mean to show that, you're actually the ruler of all of Normandy. And the paradox, again, is that the Normans were able to control all of Normandy the way the King of France hadn't been able to before the Vikings were there.
The Normans here at Falaise were part of a culture rooted in order and permanence, but they didn't completely lose touch with their Viking past. Any attempts to revolt against the new order were brutally repressed. And, as with any noble family, factional feuds were rife.
There is a lot of infighting. So one of the challenges of a duke would be to make sure that he could control quite a rowdy bunch, because they were former Vikings, so they definitely were not choir boys.
And eventually you get to this point where there are questions of succession as well, right? You can be a bit more Norman, but the way Vikings come to power could be sometimes fighting your own brother over who is going to be the ruler, yes?
And so, now family is going to be very important, the lineage. There's going to be a lot of drama, and sometimes even mysterious deaths will happen, and suddenly a brother will take over.
But one of the biggest cold cases, right, this comes to us from 1026 and kind of coalesces here, doesn't it?
So we have Robert the Magnificent, who was count of a little area next to Falaise, and there was a bit of a spat between him and his brother, Richard. Robert decided to stay in the castle, and Richard then besieged the castle here. After quite a lengthy siege, eventually Robert surrendered to Richard, and then Richard married the daughter of a king of France. It made him really very sort of officially legitimate in Normandy, and then banquet, and he dies right after the banquet. So who knows what happened? I guess we'll never know.
Richard III's brief reign from 1026 to 1027 highlighted the tension at the heart of Norman society. Normandy was a fractious place. After Richard III's mysterious death, his brother, Robert I, became Duke. He may have come to the throne through fratricide, and from this context, the most famous Norman of all was born.
There are several myths about how William's parents met, but they all involve this well below Falaise Castle. One such version says that Duke Robert spied from the castle walls the beautiful common woman Herleva here next to the well. Overcome with lust, he does what any self-respecting duke would do at the time. He sent his servants down here to ask her to come up to the castle for a little bit of off-the-books fun. Herleva said to the servants that she might be a common woman, but she was not a common hussy, and that if Robert wanted a relationship with her, she was going to enter the front gates of the castle like a lady would. The next day, she rode in resplendent on a white horse with her hair shining down, and she became Robert's official frilla, the Danish word for a concubine. Now, this might seem a little unofficial to us, but from a Norman standpoint, it was perfectly acceptable and extremely official.
When Robert and Herleva met, the course of French and English history changed. The child conceived in this meeting, William, will come to be known as the Bastard. But his origins were understood differently by contemporaries.
So now we tend to talk a lot about the fact that William is born out of wedlock. You know, we talk about how he's called William the Bastard. But at the time, that wasn't really that unusual, was it?
No, absolutely not. Because most of the Norman aristocracy at the time was born out of wedlock. So, you know, William the Bastard, yeah, so what? We are all bastards, essentially. That's what it means. So it wasn't really something that could be held against him. Probably what the Norman aristocracy would hold against him was that his mother was not from the aristocracy. She was probably accepted by most people at the time. The church probably frowned upon that, but the church was very flexible at the time.
Matthias reflects on the speed of the Viking transition into a Norman identity.
But we can imagine that after that generation, Norman dukes would no longer speak really Scandinavian, and that's when there's going to be really like a huge rift between Normans and Vikings. We can really fairly suppose that there was a bit of contempt between Normans and Vikings, Scandinavians. The Scandinavians would, well, they would actually see the Normans as former adventurers who had settled and then were farming the land, so not romantic at all. And then the Normans would actually see the Vikings as those pirates, pillagers, pagans, not worthy of respect at all. So there was really this sort of clear separation now between Norman identity and Scandinavian identity.
So on the one hand, you've gone soft, and on the other, well, you're a Viking.
Yeah, exactly. But the smart thing is that those new Normans would actually still incorporate parts of their own culture and combine it with Frankish culture. And that's how Norman culture was invented, and that's why it was so powerful. Down the generations, the Normans will end up dominating almost all of the Kingdom of France, so that's how they were successful. And of course, as they were Vikings, they would settle elsewhere, for instance, in the south of Italy and Sicily as well, and they founded a kingdom there. So if you find Normans everywhere in Europe, it's because they exported their own culture in sometimes the most unlikely of places.
So, you know, sometimes the technology that helps you isn't just about boats. It can be a social technology as well.
Yeah, exactly. So it's going to massively improve your standards of living, even just the law enforcement and how peaceful your own duchy is going to be. And we have to really remember that 11th century in Europe is a brutal environment. There is only one area that is fairly peaceful, that's Normandy. The Mont Saint-Michel thrived during that particular period because now peace had been established.
When Robert and Herleva met, the course of French and English history changed. The chaos surrounding his father's ascension to the throne would define William's early years.
This, then, is the context into which William was born. Normandy was a fractious place.
But the young Norman duke had powerful friends across the clergy and nobility. He had inherited a strong duchy. The Normans had combined Scandinavian seafaring ways of war and the Carolingian continental tradition of organization and strength. They had created something potent and new. Relative internal stability enabled them to turn their ferocious appetite outwards. Norman sights would soon be turning north. In the next episode, we explore William's precarious childhood and early military experience. By 1066, the Normans were hungry for more land and power. We see how William the Bastard became William the Conqueror, and what happens when the Norman ferocity confronts another culture.
In 1027, a young woman named Herleva, born just outside the castle walls here at Falaise, is tormented by an awful dream. A tree bursts from her stomach. Its branches overshadowing Normandy and eventually all of England. This dream is a myth, and one that's recorded about 100 years after Herleva lived. But it contains a seed of truth. The Norman hour was approaching, and it would be led by the most famous Norman to ever live, William the Conqueror.
With William the Bastard, and then the Conqueror, we come to the climax of the Norman adventure.
I've already seen how, by the time of William's birth, the Normans had amassed an incredible amount of power, melding together Scandinavian seafaring techniques with the powerful and organized violence of the Carolingians. This meant that William inherited a potent duchy, but it was one that he would have to fight for.
In this episode, William builds power in Normandy, then takes advantage of tumultuous events across the Channel to launch an invasion of England. A conquest which would bring about the most radical change in society England had ever seen. William's father, Robert the Magnificent, was sixth in a line of Norman dukes, which had begun with Rollo the Viking. Robert came to rule the duchy in 1027. He had a taste for adventure. His thirst for spiritual inspiration led him to pilgrimage in the Holy Land. But he died in Jerusalem aged just 25 in around 1043. He'd left the duchy in a disastrous state, and his young heir, William the Bastard, was immediately in danger.
Robert's death had whetted the appetites of power across Normandy. And this meant that William had a very precarious childhood. He comes into power very young. We think about 7 years old. And as a result, he's put under the governance of several tutors. Now, I say several tutors because being William's guardian was an incredibly dangerous job. And 3 in total are killed while trying to look after him. This is so incredibly violent that several myths spring up about it, including that he's hustled out of castles in the middle of the night, dressed as a commoner, and sleeps in peasants' houses, only to have a tutor killed in the same bed.
Young William sheltered from jealous rivals here at Falaise Castle. I'm meeting historian Matthias Delis.
So for a young child, 7, 8, to see that his own tutors would be killed before him would have a traumatic effect on his psyche, and it probably made him grow up much faster than he would have. It sort of desensitized him in a way, but he also had a keen sense of recapturing things that had been taken away from him, because he spent his childhood basically seeing other people taking things that belonged to him. And so, the name the Conqueror. But we could also call him William the Recapturer, because he spent much of his life recapturing what had been taken away from him.
William survived the murder attempts of his early years, although they left scars on his personality. By late 1046, William had come of age and was ruling over the duchy in his own right. In that year, several of his opponents joined forces, led by Guy of Burgundy, and plotted to remove the young duke from power. They attempted to capture William in the middle of the night at Valognes. The story goes that a jester warned William of the attack. He galloped at top speed throughout the night to take refuge back at his birthplace at Falaise.
And he was able to successfully escape his assassins.
I suppose it's something to be said for the safety that Falaise offers as well as a castle.
That's right. Strong castle walls, strong castle, so this was a place where he would definitely feel at home and feel safe.
William's deep knowledge of the landscape of Normandy had spared him, but the threat to his rule was growing. He faced a rebellion of nearly half his subordinates. So, William rode directly to the French King Henry's court in Poissy, where he reminded the king that a revolt against his faithful vassal was a revolt against the king himself. It might seem odd because only a few years earlier, Henry had been attacking the borders of Normandy.
But William has made a very shrewd political move here. See, he's calling into question the entire system of vassalage. As the king's vassal, he has every right to present himself and demand protection. If Henry says no, then what's the point of being a king's vassal anyway?
The pressure was on King Henry to keep the structure of the feudal system in place and to support William against his cousin Guy of Burgundy and the rebel forces. William and Henry combined forces and rode out to meet the rebels on the plains to the southeast of Caen.
Now, we don't have super great records about exactly what happened there. Our best come from Wass's Roman de Raux, and according to him, a certain rebel named Ralph Tyson decides at the very last moment to switch sides. He brings with him about 400 men and 140 cavalrymen. This makes an incredibly big difference. The rebels are pushed into the River Orme, and many of them drown because of the weight of their armor. William and Henry then go on to hunt down the rebels, capturing many of them, while a few get away. And this marks a huge difference in the trajectory of William's career. For the next few years, he'll spend his time hunting down various rebels and securing his borders. Even 3 years later, in 1050, he besieges the castle of Guy of Burgundy, taking the castle and exiling Guy. We learn a little bit about William's personality here. This is a guy who can hold grudges. If he thinks that you have wronged him, he will hunt you down, and he very well might win.
The Battle of Valais-Dun was not the end of William's struggle to gain the upper hand over his nobility. Continuous warfare raged on. But William had learned how to combine diplomacy with military strategy. The battle was a key turning point in tightening his grip over Normandy. William was now strong enough to turn his attention outwards and annex land nearby. Passy was the last new territory to be added to the duchy. In the process, William besieged the strategically important castle of Alençon. His brutal actions there were an infamous example of William's increasing ruthlessness.
The castle at Alençon had sided with William's enemy, the Count of Anjou, and as a result, William felt the need to attack it. When he showed up, however, the people inside decided they were going to antagonize him slightly. Legend has it that they hung skins out over the top and beat them, saying, "We want the skin of the tanner, we want the skin of the tanner," which is allegedly a reference to William's grandfather's humble origins. Rather than scaring him off, this enrages William. He took the castle and apparently cut the hands and feet off those who had been taunting him. The entire story might be an exaggeration, playing up on William's humble origins. The violence is fairly believable, though.
William had secured Normandy's borders. Now, he looked to secure the future of his dynasty through marriage. His chosen wife was Matilda of Flanders from the other great territory in northern France. She was also of royal blood through her mother Adela. In the city of Caen stands the magnificent abbey Matilda founded in the heart of Normandy.
There's actually evidence to suggest that William and Matilda were a love match. First off is that William got to pick whoever he wanted to marry.
super odd for someone in his position of power, but his father was dead and his mother didn't really have any power of her own, and he wanted Matilda. Secondly, we don't have any evidence that William had a concubine, and that's really, really odd, both for Normans and medieval rulers more generally at the time. So if he doesn't have any pieces on the side, he probably really likes his wife. The third piece of evidence is this building itself, because it was built in penance because the Pope insisted that William and Matilda shouldn't marry, and they did it anyway. You see, William and Matilda's marriage took place at a time when the papacy was increasingly trying to insist that it got to decide who was married. And this is incredibly new. Usually, royalty and nobility just married whoever they wanted to. But increasingly, as time went on, the papacy wanted to ensure that they were involved. Usually so that they could swing their own power around and also stop powerful couples from getting married if they felt like they shouldn't.
A marriage alliance between Normandy and Flanders would make William very powerful. So there might be people, for example, the German emperor, who are like, not so sure this is a good idea, or other people in France, who are like, well, this is going to set up somebody who's very powerful already, make him more powerful. Is there some way we can stop this marriage?
So Pope Leo IX says that William and Matilda can't marry because they are fifth cousins. And also, more nebulously, at one point in time, William's father had been betrothed to Matilda's mother, but nothing ever came of it. So technically, they couldn't get married because of consanguinity, or the idea that they were too closely related. But fifth cousins get married all the time.
The meeting of two incredibly rich and powerful areas is too much too soon for Pope Leo. So he steps in. But despite the challenges from the papacy, William and Matilda married in 1051. They then fell out of favor with the church.
By the time Pope Leo IX dies and Pope Nicholas II comes in, they see an opportunity to reconcile with the papacy. As part of that, Pope Nicholas II says that they can create 2 abbeys, and as a result, that will get them right with God. See, the monks and nuns in abbeys can pray for your soul, and that will help get rid of any sins that you've committed.
William followed Matilda's lead and also built a huge abbey in Caen, the Abbey aux Hommes. Founding the 2 abbeys in the same Norman city served several purposes, not least to restore relations with the papacy. But William and Matilda were also acting out of faith.
Both, particularly William's very pious, we know, and Matilda also. They think, well, we need to be above suspicion. So they do found the abbeys, not just, I think, because it's a way of doing penance for a possibly consanguineous marriage. Founding abbeys is what you do if you are a high-ranking noble person.
It was no coincidence that these important new abbeys were founded in Caen. William wanted an outpost of power in Lower Normandy, strategically crucial to face any rebellions by his noblemen. He set about making the new town of Caen the second city of his duchy.
Wow! This is the Abbey aux Hommes in Caen, and it was founded by William the Conqueror in 1063. It's a Benedictine monastery, which is the oldest form of rule of monks. This is also possibly the most important piece of Romanesque architecture in Normandy. Now, Romanesque architecture is the kind that comes a bit before Gothic architecture. You'll know you have a Romanesque building if you have very rounded arches on it, and it doesn't have a lot of extra detail work, no very fancy gargoyles. And for them, this is a way of saying, I'm a new kind of Roman. I understand the connection between Rome and power and Rome and the church. We can see that William is a very astute and cultured guy who understands the place of power and Christianity in his duchy. Now, it's a real statement about the riches that William has. If you're going to build something this impressive, it means you've got money. If you're going to build something this impressive, it also means you need people. And Caen was a small town before William got to it, but he wanted to make it a city. Building an abbey like this will do that. And now, if you think that this abbey is impressive in the 21st century, and it absolutely is, consider what it would mean for people who were living where they didn't see buildings that were higher than 2 stories tall.
they're going to understand that Caen is a new city and a new place to be, full of Norman power.
But although relations with the papacy had been restored, there was a looming threat from the French throne. King Henry I of France, William's former protector and ally, was worried about William's growing power and took advantage of any opportunities he could find to support William's rivals. This monument of a Norman helmet and shield marks the bloody spot where it all came to a head.
By 1057, tensions between the French throne and Normandy had come to a head, and it happened here at Varaville.
King Henry's men bypassed the town of Caen on their way to attack Normandy's capital, Rouen. They wanted to put an end to William's ambitions once and for all. They were forced to take the one road open to them near Varaville. This trapped them into a tight formation between a lagoon and a marsh. As the tide rolled in and King Henry's men were split in two, William took the opportunity to pounce. He ambushed the men and massacred half the king's army. The king could do nothing. He was reduced to contemplating the disaster from a nearby hill.
It was a complete disaster. This put a complete end to all of Henry's ambitions for Normandy. 2 years later, he would sign a peace accord with William and die. Normandy was officially secure.
Varaville marks the point where real Norman independence began. William had cut his teeth in the relentless defense of his territory, and Normandy was never invaded again in his lifetime. Now that he was in firm control of his homeland, it was time to look outwards, across the sea. While William was busy strengthening his rule in Normandy, a succession crisis was brewing across the Channel. It makes up some of the opening scenes of the great piece of Norman propaganda that was created in the following decade. We know it as the Bayeux Tapestry. The King of England, Edward the Confessor, had no natural successor. In 1064, he sent his brother-in-law, Harold Godwinson, a supremely wealthy nobleman from the House of Wessex, to Normandy. Harold's visit is shrouded in mystery. Some accounts even suggest he was shipwrecked on the French coast and taken prisoner. If he was in Normandy intentionally, it may have been to free his nephew and brother, who were William's prisoners. Either way, Harold was taken under William's wing in hunting trips and even got involved in the Normans' military exploits.
Harold had come down to Normandy to help William in a campaign against the Bretons. Here at Mont Saint-Michel, he actually distinguished himself as he rode out valiantly to rescue several knights who become trapped in the quicksand. So we know that there's already an established relationship between the Normans and the English, just maybe not as strong as it would subsequently become.
On January 5th, 1066, the elderly Edward the Confessor died, sparking one of the bloodiest periods in English history. Edward's closest living heir, his great-nephew Edgar the Atheling, was just 14 years old and ill-prepared. He was written off, and in the confusion that followed, 3 rival claimants for the throne emerged. Earl Harold Godwinson, the powerful Earl of Wessex, brother-in-law and friend of the late king. He claimed that Edward the Confessor named him as successor on his deathbed. Harold Hardrada, a Viking and king of Norway. He was a distant relative of King Canute, who had previously been a king of England when the Vikings had invaded. And Duke William, a close kinsman of the late king, his first cousin once removed. William claimed Edward had promised him the throne in 1051, and that Harold Godwinson had sworn an oath that he would help William succeed Edward, in return for helping Godwinson in Normandy in 1064. Whatever the case, William was convinced he was the rightful king of England. Harold was accepted as king by the English magnates, and William decided on war. William convened a council of his leading nobles in Normandy to announce his plans for conquest. He bestowed special authority on his wife Matilda and his son Robert. William also sought international approval for his venture.
If you're going to go and invade another kingdom, which was not the norm, even in the 11th century, people didn't generally do that. You need to make sure you've got everything sorted. You need to make sure you've secured your borders at home, you've got good people in charge, and it does help if you've got the church on side. So Lanfranc, who is William's close confidant, goes off to Rome to sell this to the Pope and say, we need your blessing on the invasion of England. And one of the ways they're able to do that is because the incumbent Archbishop of Canterbury, Stigand, is very problematic. He's been excommunicated by several popes, so they can sell it as a way of saying, well, you know, we'll invade and we can also clean up the English church.
Throughout the summer of 1066, William built up his army. Meanwhile, Norwegian King Harald Hardrada was launching his own invasion of England. 200 Viking longboats sailed on the northeast coast of England and descended on York. At the same time, William's army took their time preparing to leave Normandy and get their southern invasion of England started.
There was a huge delay before William set out across the English Channel. And there's a couple of theories as to why. According to William of Poitiers, it was due to unfavorable winds, and as you can see, yes, Normandy does have some of those, but a month of them is perhaps a bit much. Which gives rise to another theory, and that is one of cunning. You see, the delay also kind of adds up to about how long we would expect a messenger to take to get from Harald Hardrada in the north down here to Normandy to William. And William might have thought he would just wait it out and see how long Harold was going to be distracted in the north of England before he set out. Either way, timing is incredibly crucial to success in England.
Across the Channel, King Harold and his men made the long journey from London to Yorkshire. On the 25th of September 1066, the English army faced up to the invading Norwegian force at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. After a bloody battle, Hardrada and most of his army was killed. Harold Godwinson had come out on top, but he had no time to cherish victory. In Normandy on September 27th, the winds turned in William's favor. The second invasion of England that year was underway.
Imagine the scenes as this beach is full of boats with William preparing for his invasion. But what would have been really weird was the number of horses that you would see here. The Normans were building up tens of horses, loading them on these boats, and then getting ready to take them across the sea to pillage, but, you know, just over there for a change.
William embarked his army and set sail. The following morning, on September 28, 1066, he landed, took the unresisting towns of Pevensey and Hastings, and began to organize a bridgehead, complete with a quick-build castle. The Normans rarely went anywhere without building a fortress. Harold raced south with his exhausted troops. Battle was about to commence. Now, we all know the outcome of the Battle of Hastings, the battle that gave England its most famous date. But this wasn't just a battle. It was a momentous turning point in European history. And to really understand Hastings and see it through the eyes of contemporaries, we have to examine our key source, where most of our knowledge about the battle comes from. The incredible Bayeux Tapestry, probably commissioned a decade after the battle to embellish the newly built Bayeux Cathedral. I've referred to it before, but there's nothing like seeing the real thing, up close and personal, and over 900 years old.
I'll tell you this. When you're a medieval historian, you see pictures of the Bayeux Tapestry constantly. When I was first learning medieval Latin from classical, they would put translations of it in front of us so that we could understand the difference. But seeing it in person is so incredibly different. You get such texture from all of the embroidery. The colors absolutely pop. Something that someone said to me once is that the Bayeux Tapestry is actually smaller than you think it is, but this is so much bigger. I was thinking it would be like a sheet of A4 paper, not something this large. And you really see how the narrative works. It's moving you up and through it. It's really a kind of magic, a kind of movie, a kind of comic book almost. All of these colors still absolutely pop. You've got detail work on all of the churches. You can see the individual tiles on the roof. And, you can see the joints in the armor of the various people. And all of this is just for someone who's seen it repeatedly. Imagine you're living 1,000 years ago and you're presented with something like this. How rich and grand is this as a piece of art in a world before movies? It's absolutely an overwhelming kind of sense of beauty and also technique.
The Bayeux Tapestry provides us with a remarkable narrative, illustrating the saga from the initial justification of William the Conqueror's claim to the throne to the ultimate outcome at Hastings. To learn more, I'm meeting historian Martin Bostel.
Martin, I suppose the best place to begin is at the beginning. So who do we see depicted here? We've got a lot of named characters immediately.
There is a lot of name dropping in the Bayeux Tapestry. Here you have Edward the Confessor, and he's speaking to Harold, his brother-in-law, and also Earl of Wessex. And we don't know actually what he's telling him, but from different texts, we can imagine that he sent him to Normandy to speak about his little cousin, William, to promise him the throne of England after Edward's death.
So we have also a lot of interesting animals along here. Medieval people, they love to put a symbol in a border.
There is a lot of symbol in the Bayeux Tapestry. So here you can see the raven, which is on the top of the tree, and also the fox under it. And you can see the cheese, which is the goal of the two animals between them. So we don't know who is winning.
So I guess that this is a little bit of foreshadowing about what's about to happen.
Yes, of course.
Oh, so the ships are arriving. They've gone to Pevensey.
Yes.
And now we're in England.
Yes, and we are in Hastings. It's written here, Hastinga. Yeah. And you have to imagine at the time that the Norman was invaders and they was not very kind to the different people living in the south of England. They took animals, killing them for feeding the army, and you can see them taking up like maybe a pig, I don't know, and here an ox. Actually, the tapestry is kind of smart about it because they don't show murder.
Soon after dawn on the 14th of October, Harold arranged his forces. On the English side, 8,000 soldiers stretched for half a mile, tired from defeating Harold's forces at Stamford Bridge. William ranged his army to the south, also numbering 8,000. His Norman troops were in the center, probably with the Bretons to the west and the French to the east. The battle happened here on Senlac Hill in Sussex. Harold and the English on the upper ground, William and the Normans attacking from below. But the real evidence for what took place is on the tapestry. The battle was about to begin.
See, we're finally actually entering battle.
Yes, battle is preparing here. So it's going to be a bloody, bloody battle during all day. Here you can see the first charge of the Norman against the Saxon, which are depicted only in foot.
On foot,
They didn't use horses at the time for battle, only for travel.
What I'm really struck by in terms of seeing this is how much movement there is when you see it. So it really comes alive. It doesn't seem like a static piece. It really feels almost like a movie or something as you move along.
There's a real surge of movement, and it's mainly using colors to show the different elements, like a horse have legs from different color, showing the depth of the iconography.
So one of the things that I've noticed here is that now that we're in battle, we've lost our animals of the bottom border, and instead we have scenes from the battle. And here it seems
things are getting pretty decisive. You know, we've got people with their heads cut off. Here we have corpses whose armor is being looted. So it seems like the tide is really turning here.
Yes, the tide is turning here. And from the first attack of the battle, there is no animal on the lower border, only the victim of the battle to show what a bloody mess it was at the time.
The battle raged on all day. Imagine the grim scene. The hillside slippery with blood and littered with bodies, arrows, and broken weapons. The fear of the surviving combatants, and the commanders shouting to rally their exhausted forces. With the autumn daylight fading, the Normans made one final effort to take the ridge. By that time, Harold's two brothers and other English commanders were almost certainly dead. Then came the decisive moment.
And here we are arrived nearly at the end of the battle in the famous scene where Harold is going to be killed, and it's kind of a mystery of its own. In the construction of the scene, you can saw just before the death of Harold that there is a character holding a stick with an animal, which is a wyvern, which was at the time the symbol of the House of Wessex. And just before, the wyvern is on the ground and is stepped on by a horse, so it can indicate the end of the House of Essex itself, just before the death of Harold. So what's particular about the scene of the death of Harold is that we are not actually sure which character it's referred here, because you can see one of those characters which seems to have an arrow in the eye. But just after, you can see a character which is sliced on the knee, which is the version of the death of Harold. So we don't know which of those characters are Harold, and maybe it's both two versions of the death, depending of what was said at the time. Maybe he was struck by an arrow, then sliced by a Norman knight.
At a time when such conquests were often decided within 1 hour, 9 hours of grueling conflict were needed to settle this battle. The tapestry depicts this day as the crucial moment of the Norman conquest of England, the heroic scene when a worthy foe was beaten into the ground. But the reality was far different. Winning a single victory in the south was only the beginning of the battle to rule the whole country. The Bayeux Tapestry portrays the whole lengthy conquest project as a single God-given triumph decided on the battlefield. It was pure spin.
Where would this be displayed? Who is it for? Who is it talking to?
It's actually the whole mystery here. It's talking obviously to a lot of people, both English and French and Norman at the time. But we have to remind us that it's not the reality, but only a propaganda and a selected version of the reality that serve a purpose here.
The Battle of Hastings was only the start of a massive upheaval. Work lay ahead for William. He needed to conquer the rest of the country and take his place as king. He marched to secure the strategically important towns of Dover, then Canterbury. Norman military might intimidated those in their path, and they faced little resistance in the southeast. As he marched around London, he accepted the surrender of the Saxon establishment. Stigand, the Archbishop of Canterbury, submitted to William at Wallingford. And at Berkhamsted, Eldred, the Archbishop of York, surrendered. By December, William and his advancing Normans reached the capital, London.
It was here on Christmas Day, 1066, that William the Conqueror is the first king ever crowned inside the beautiful Westminster Abbey. And his coronation was a truly multicultural affair. You had the Old English barons proclaiming the entire ceremony in Old English. At the same time, it was being translated into Norman French by William's parties. But because it was a multicultural affair, there was also a slight cultural misunderstanding. When the English went out to sing the praises of their new king and gave a clamorous yell, the Normans outside thought their new king was under attack. So in retaliation, they began to burn all of the houses around Westminster Abbey down. This made smoke blow into the abbey. And then everyone inside thought the new king was under attack. So they all rush out into the street. Riots start. There's fighting everywhere. Only William is left inside with the clergy shaking as he's finally crowned king. It's an incredibly interesting portrait of William, because usually we're led to see him as this all-powerful conqueror who comes and takes what is his. But here we see him as an incredibly vulnerable, frightened man. And it shows us that while William may have conquered, he still had a long way to go if he wanted to rule. After the absolute fiasco of his coronation, William realized that oaths and words weren't going to do enough to ensure that everybody knew he was the King of England. He needed something more, a real symbol of his military prowess. And that became the architectural symbol that we now know as the Tower of London. Look at the White Tower. It's absolutely dominating when you come and stand underneath it. But think about how much more threatening it would have been in the 11th century. And that's kind of the point. This isn't just a building. It's an actual military threat to the people of London. And I assure you, they would have felt it. This was the tallest building in London for quite some time. In the same way, this tower makes me feel small now. It dominated the skyline of London and loomed over the psyche of every single English person who was just trying to live day to day in their own capital. But this reveals a little bit something about their position. The White Tower isn't just a way of dominating the skyline and threatening everyone. It also shows they feel really unsafe, and they're worried that the English might at any moment rise against them, and they will need somewhere to retreat.
We've already seen in Caen how William loved building in stone. Well, he liked it so much, he wanted to import not just the architecture from Normandy, but the building materials too.
For me, the most exciting part of the Tower of London is these stones. They were actually imported all the way from Caen by William, and it's a physical link between his capitals there in Normandy and here in London. We call it Caen stone, and you can see it's really chunky. They're part of the balustrading that would have kept the original keep safe. And you can just imagine the stubbornness of loading these rocks onto ships to bring here in order to say this is now a part of Normandy. So these stones are still here, but the Tower of London wasn't originally a stone edifice. It started out as being wooden. And it's not until 1078, according to the Textus Ranulphus, that the stone fortifications began. They were overseen by the Bishop of Rochester, Gundulf, who was a Norman, so could be trusted with these kind of things. And you will notice that it's not just the stones from Caen that link it to Normandy, it's the architecture itself. This looks a lot like the Abbaye aux Alpes. You see these wonderful Romanesque rounded arches over all the windows, and the incredibly simple towers at the sides. It means that William is here as much as he is in Normandy, because we have Norman buildings for Norman rulers.
I've come to Rochester Castle, another one of the Norman power bases established early on after the conquest to control the local population. Places like Rochester Castle embedded the Normans in England and enabled William to get back to the continent. Just 3 months after William's Christmas coronation, he was confident enough to return to Normandy.
But to make sure he maintains control in England, he does a couple of things. First, he takes noble hostages. They go back to Normandy, they're treated very well, but it's very clear that they're under his control. It's a vague threat. He also leaves Normans in positions of power. Here in Rochester, that's the Bishop Gundulf. He's both overseeing construction at the Tower of London and here. All right, so if what William wants from England is a bunch of money and then to go back to Normandy and build abbeys, what's in it for all the Normans who stay here? The answer is it's also kind of Norman to stay here. They are a warrior culture, and their loyalty is predicated on getting land when they take over somewhere. You can't do that back in France anymore. William needs to stay in good with the king, but you can do it in England. So say you're a Norman without any lands or titles, you can get them here in England.
It's better to be rich and in England than back in France with no money.
In replacing the English landowning elite and the church elite with his Norman supporters, William embedded a new nobility, whose names, language, and impact would echo throughout the following centuries. Norman castles, huge hulks of stone built to dominate, would change the landscape of England. Nothing like this kind of architecture had existed in England before, so the Normans were at their most distinctive here. I'm meeting historian Mark Morris to understand the roles of castles in conquest.
So Mark, here we are in Rochester. There's this incredible Norman castle here. Obviously, they want to secure this area. What makes Rochester so important?
Well, it's its position on the River Medway. Since time immemorial, this has been an absolutely crucial crossing point and a crucial point that you want to defend. And this must be the place where the Normans cross the Medway in order to approach London. And very soon after the conquest is complete and William is crowned, a castle would be planted here. So the Normans probably put something here in the autumn of 1066. And then in the months and years that follow, the castle is granted to William's younger half-brother, the notorious Bishop Odo of Bayeux. So he's the person creating the first castle on this site. And then eventually, by the time you get to the 12th century, we get this magnificent great stone tower, the tallest, certainly, Norman stone tower in the British Isles.
So obviously this is kind of what we would call a quintessentially Norman castle, but what does that mean?
If you've seen the Tower of London, you'll remember the Tower of London is squatter and it doesn't have this extra building sticking out the side, the so-called forebuilding. So if you like, the Tower of London is the daddy, it's the prototype. This is now settling into what I would call an archetype. As you say, it is a very typically Norman building. It's superlatively tall, but otherwise it's got all the kind of features you expect to see of a building of this age. You can see very clearly that it is built with defence in mind, because we start off on the ground floor there, we've got tiny little single light openings, almost like an arrow slit. And then as you go up through the stages, the windows get bigger and grander. So by the time you reach the top floor, they're letting in quite a lot of light. But of course, by that point, you're 80 feet up in the air, so who cares? It is a building built to keep you out. We've got the entrance at first floor level, and now we've got this forebuilding, which you see creeping in the early 12th century. And partly that's to protect the entrance to the Great Tower itself. It's also, it gives you a ceremonial space and a sort of a waiting room for people who are waiting to get into the Great Tower to meet the very important person who's inside. Lords in this period, whether they're bishops, archbishops, barons or kings, they're constantly on the move. They're constantly in the saddle. So this might only be lived in for 2 or 3 weeks a year by its lord. But the rest of the year, it stands there. It stands as sort of a standing threat to the people around it of, know your place, we are in charge.
It would take William 6 years to consolidate his conquest. In those years, he faced constant uprisings from the English.
There are minor rebellions in 1067, but they start to grow in momentum and size from one year to the next. There's a big rebellion down in the West Country in 1068. There's a big rising in the Midlands in 1068. And then in 1069, you have a huge rebellion in the north, 2 in the course of 1069. And not just the natives rising in Northumbria and northern England, but also supported by an invasion from Denmark. So, and there really is a sense there. We think of 1066 as being like a date that's set in stone. We know, you and I know, the Norman conquest isn't going to be reversed. People at the time didn't have that benefit of hindsight. So for them, the Norman conquest could have been a flash in the pan. And you sense that in the sources in 1069, that they are going to drive these guys out. And William finds that wherever else he's gone, the sort of standard way of dealing with rebellions after the fighting and the killing is to plant a castle. So you plant a new castle like here at Rochester or the Tower of London or anywhere. In the north, he plants a castle at York, it is destroyed. He plants another castle at York, it is destroyed and overrun. So what do you do in order to stop that? If you can't hold the land, you make damn sure no one can hold the land. You make it, you know, that's the famous phrase, you create a desert and call it peace.
1069 to 1070, William the Conqueror laid waste to the north of England. The harrying of the north is recorded in the 12th century Annals of Durham.
So great a famine prevailed that men, compelled by hunger, devoured human flesh, that of horses, dogs, and cats, and whatever custom abhors. Others sold themselves to perpetual slavery, so that they might in any way preserve their wretched existence.
And writing about the harrying of the north, the Anglo-Norman chronicler Odoric Vitalis wrote,
The king stopped at nothing to hunt his enemies. He cut down many people and destroyed homes and land. Nowhere else had he shown such cruelty. He ordered that crops and herds, tools and food be burned to ashes. More than 100,000 people perished of starvation.
This isn't just a story about the heroic deeds of glorious men. There is a human toll to war, and it matters.
Normans had always used brutality to suppress the rebellious English. But the destruction wrought by the harrying of the north was at an unprecedented scale, a grim message to all their new subjects. After the harrying, there were no more major rebellions. By the 1080s, conquest was secure enough for William to set about on a project to investigate and record the potential wealth of his new kingdom. I've come to the National Archives to see the result of this unmatched administrative project, the 2-volume Domesday Book of 1086. The National Archives look after the original book, nearly 1,000 years old. But to get into the details, I'm looking at a facsimile copy with curator Jess Nelson.
Okay, so let me start you off with a huge question for a huge book. Exactly what is Doomsday?
I mean, that is a big question because inevitably it's for several different things, but we need to see it in the context of William the Conqueror's conquered kingdom. So it's a survey of lands and landholding in his conquered kingdom, which he was able to use to see how much tax could potentially be levied on that kingdom.
The town of Ripon in North Yorkshire is an example of how detailed information about the wealth and resources of the land were recorded. In Ripon of St. Wilfrid's League, there could be 10 ploughs. Archbishop Eldred held this manor. Now, Archbishop Thomas has in his demesnes 2 ploughs and 1 mill, 1 fishery rendering, 8 villeins and 10 borders having 6 ploughs. There are 10 acres of meadow and scrubland.
In recording who's holding the land and the resources of the land, he's also recording, in effect, his conquest and consolidating his status as the king. He was very keen to emphasize his legitimacy. He didn't, I don't think, necessarily see himself as a conqueror. He saw himself as the heir. And by writing this all down, by enshrining the kind of new structures of society, the Norman elite, himself and his family and his tenants-in-chief, the men, mostly men, some women who hold lands from him, he's enshrining those new structures of society. He's really making a statement about his power and about his status as of the king of this kingdom. But it's also a sort of a presentation document. I think he wants people to almost revere it. It mentions that the natives, so the English, call it Doomsday as in reference to Doomsday as the Day of Judgment, because it kind of records everything and there can be no appeal against it, just like there will be no appeal against the Day of Judgment. So it's obvious that even in its own time, Doomsday had a really significant reputation. It wasn't a document that was put together and then kind of faded away. It always had this austere and important and reverential reputation.
Well, one thing that I think is quite interesting to talk about, though, in terms of this sort of representing what it is that William intends to do with the kingdom, this is sort of reflected in the way that everything is itemized here, because it's not just that it's saying, oh, this is the entries for Kent. It leads sort of with who owns them, right?
Absolutely. And actually, we should think of it in terms of who holds the land rather than who owns the land, because one of the really important things about the Norman conquest is it sort of brings in this slightly different structure where William, in effect, has acquired the entire kingdom. So he owns the entire kingdom. He holds England of God alone, if you like. And everybody who holds land elsewhere in England ultimately holds it of him.
And as part of that, it also kind of positions him as a kind of rightful new king of England, right? Because it gives us not just the snapshot of time when Doomsday was created, but before then as well.
The survey itself, there was a sort of set of questions that were asked about each of the manors, but it doesn't ask just about how it is now when the survey is taking place. It asks the questions about what the situation was in the time of King Edward, that's Edward the Confessor, and then at the time that it was re-granted, which is effectively at the time of the conquest, and then now, which is at the time of the survey. And it records all those details, but it just records them as the time of King Edward, and then it might use a term like afterwards, and then now. And it never, ever refers to the conquest. And that's one of the most fascinating things about it, that even though William is, of course, a new king, virtually all the tenants-in-chief are new men, as I say, in some cases women. They're continental, almost all of them. Very, very few of the Anglo-Saxon tenants-in-chief survive. But it doesn't refer to that at all. If Doomsday was your only piece of evidence for England at that time, you wouldn't know there had been a conquest.
So do you have any nice little bits of colour that we find in the Doomsday Book?
One of the other great things about Doomsday is it records the customs in the boroughs, which were sort of the urban centres. So here we've got Chester, and down here it's talking about the consequences for brewing bad beer. And it mentions that if those people who were found guilty of brewing bad beer have to have a trip on on what is literally translated as the dung stool. So I assume that they're being kind of sat on a stool and dipped in poo.
Wow. So that is so interesting to me, because I'm really obsessed with the way that we talk about who brews bad beer, because it's how we find out about women all the time in the Middle Ages, because one, they're brewing beer, and then two, they get in trouble if it's done badly. But I've never heard of that before. Very, very common to put a woman on a chair and have everyone come by and yell at her for brewing bad beer. But in Chester, they're going above and beyond.
They absolutely are.
Women also appear in Doomsday entries as landholders.
There are far fewer women landholders in Doomsday, but there are still a sizable number. There are around 20 female tenants-in-chief compared to perhaps a couple of hundred male tenants-in-chief. So it's certainly a minority. But you do get women landholders. I think in most situations where women hold land as part of their family, they hold it often as widows. Sometimes they hold lands which they've been granted by their husbands for their support during their marriages. I think we shouldn't just assume, because there aren't all that many women mentioned in Doomsday, that women had no power. It doesn't tell us everything.
Another typical entry of the Doomsday Book is the village of Hadlow in Kent.
So we've got Richard of Tunbridge holds Hadlow of the Bishop. So that's Odo of Bayeux, who was also Earl of Kent. And then it talks, as I say, about how much it's worth in terms of its taxable worth. It talks about the land for how many ploughshares there are, the different types of men that work on the lands. It also mentions that there are 10 slaves. So these are the sort of peasants who are very much totally at the bottom of the social scale, who have no resources of their own and very few rights. And then it tells us in the time of King Edward and after, and now it was worth £30. So it's been worth £30, which is a sizable amount of money since before the conquest. And, if you live in Hadlow now, you could read that, and it mentions the church, which still stands. So there's actually some really tangible elements which are still there today.
Look at this absolutely sweet and wonderful Saxon church. It looks nothing like any of the Norman architecture we've seen so far. Very small windows, very chunky construction. And that's because it was built in the 10th century, which makes it and Hadlow incredibly remarkable, because not many churches survive in the Norman conquest. Hadlow before the Norman conquest was a pretty sizable place, and we know in the Doomsday Book that it had about 72 houses. That's a pretty sizable settlement. Very interestingly though, the person that all this land was taken from was actually a woman But before you go thinking that this is kind of like story of a feminist wronged, that woman held a lot of enslaved people. And this is one of the big changes that Normans bring in. Old English nobles were very happy to enslave people. But Normans, because they are consummate Christians, don't think it's a great idea for Christians to be enslaving Christians. And it's a practice that they abolish. So it's a kind of swings and roundabout situation. On the one hand, you have land taken off of local women and given to foreign men. But on the other hand, well, there's a lot of women who were enslaved who are freed as a result of this, in addition, of course, to the men and children. And these are the kind of interesting stories that you have to dig through the data of the Doomsday Book to get. There's humans behind those numbers.
As the Doomsday Survey was compiled in England, William was back on the continent. Once again, he was drawn into conflict with the Franks, leading a counter-offensive against King Philip's annexation of outlying Normandy territory. He goes to Vexin to address these skirmishes at the border. It's there that William receives a wound which eventually ends up killing him. William died in Rouen early in the morning of September 9th, 1087, at the age of 59, having ruled England for 21 years and Normandy for 31 more, ever since he had inherited the duchy aged 7. When William died, the wealthier nobles and knights in attendance immediately left to protect their property across Normandy. They knew the conqueror's death would lead to uncertainty and upheaval across the duchy. Those household servants who stayed behind, says Odoric,
seized the arms, vessels, clothing, linen, and all the royal furnishings, and hurried away, leaving the king's body almost naked on the floor of the house.
It was decided that William's body would be taken to Caen and buried in the church in the Abbaye aux Almes. It fell to a common knight to make the burial arrangements. When it came time to bury William's heavy body, it was discovered that the stone sarcophagus had been made too short. There was an attempt to force the bloated corpse, and, says Odoric,
the swollen bowels burst, and an intolerable stench assailed the nostrils of the bystanders and the whole crowd.
The smell could not be masked, and the rites were hurriedly concluded.
It might be a bit surprising now to people that a king of England would choose to be buried in Normandy, but this tells us a lot about life in the 11th century. See, for William, he's a Norman first and foremost. That's what his life was about. If he can get power overseas, that's fantastic. However, Normandy is an incredibly rich and important place. This is where he wants to be connected to. Sure, it's great to be the king of England, but he is the Duke of Normandy, and this is where he wants to be buried. So being buried here really says Normandy is actually the place that the family is focusing on.
The division of land in William's inheritance also reflects this. His oldest son, Robert, receives Normandy, and his younger son, William Rufus, receives England.
Robert and William then, like any good Norman, immediately start to fight each other over each other's land. It's a really Norman sickness. Within this system, your subordinates expect land in return for fighting for you. And this means that boundaries constantly have to be expanded. This always results in violence.
Normandy would continue to be of huge importance even further down the line of the Anglo-Norman dynasty. So-called kings of England continued to have their body parts buried in the great religious houses of Normandy, long after William the Conqueror set the trend.
I'm in Rouen Cathedral, and this is the tomb of Richard the Lionheart. And this is very, very interesting for our purposes because it shows you that even 200 years after the conquest of England, English kings still thought of themselves as Norman. This is where Richard the Lionheart's heart is buried. And it shows us that he really thinks of himself as a Norman. Sure, he's the king of England, and he would absolutely tell you that. But he spent way more time in Normandy over the course of his lifetime than he ever did back in his home shores. So if you asked Richard the Lionheart, he would absolutely tell you that he was the king of England. But he was also a Norman,
and he identified with that so much that this is where he wanted to be buried.
The Lionheart's heart would forever be in Normandy. The Normans had arrived in England and with them brought language, culture, and a new way of doing things. They imposed a new aristocracy, savagely cutting down opposition, and built scores of castles and cathedrals to intimidate and control. This was medieval shock and awe. They've kept historians busy ever since.
From my point of view, the Norman conquest is the biggest change that England ever undergoes, because what happens as a result of the Norman conquest is the ruling class is swept clean away. And I don't just mean the king and the earls and the barons, I mean right down to the level of local lordship. 9 times out of 10, when you go into a village or a manor, the person in charge is a foreigner speaking a different language with utterly different, alien ideas about the way society should be regulated. That's the driver of change. The fact that you have the entire ruling class that takes over speaks French and they are ruling a bunch of people who speak English, that means you get this crazy mashup that we today call modern English. Had that not happened, you and I would be speaking something nowadays that sounds a lot more like modern Flemish. So you get obviously castles, you get, this brand new architectural style, Romanesque. Every major church is ripped down and rebuilt in this new style. You get changes in attitude towards human life, so slavery starts to wane after the conquest. Chivalry comes in. The Anglo-Saxons have been very happy to murder each other, over dinner. The Normans, for all their viciousness on the battlefield and in war, they didn't do that, so you get a chivalrous society. You might say all of these things would have happened anyway. England would have become part of the kind of European mainstream, and this change would have happened gradually. What makes the Norman conquest so important and so exciting is it just happens overnight because of that replacement of the ruling class.
Exploring the Normans is a wild ride into some dark corners of history. And some brilliant creations. How marine marauders settled, became formidable rulers, carved out a corner of what's now France, and then struck out and won themselves a kingdom, building a monumental place in history.
The Normans were exceptional conquerors, but military prowess isn't enough. Conquering doesn't give you the ability to settle. And that's why even more impressive was their ability to adapt. So much so that here at the Tower of London, these crowds of tourists are not here to see Norman history. They would tell you they were here to see the history of Britain. These Viking conquerors came to settle. So much so that today, you might not even realize they'd been here in the first place.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.